So, Adrienne, congratulations on your essay. I want to start off with a really provocative sentence that you have that people complain about distracted driving, but really, driving is the distraction. Talk about that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a lot of times when people look at problems, um, they often don't look at it the right way. Like they'll say, okay, well, self-driving cars is going to make it so that we can eliminate taxi drivers. But I think when you think about what self-driving cars really solve, it's not that it's going to eliminate drivers, but rather it's the idea that driving gets in the way of living.
Hmm.
And we make all of these small trade-offs that I think many of us don't realize when for example, I'm deciding to see a friend. I have to think about, well, how many drinks am I going to have that night? Like, not more than one over the course of the night. Should we go to a bar or should we go out to dinner and not have alcohol? Or when I decide if I want to take the shuttle home from work versus driving my own car, I have to think about, well, I don't like driving. I want to be focused on a phone call with my friend, but I don't want to be in a public space. I'm making all these mini trade offs in deciding whether or not I want to drive. And what self driving cars will do is make it so that we don't have to make these trade offs.
So, talk about your experience at Tesla and what are some of the realizations that you had there that led into this essay?
Yeah, that's a good question. So at Tesla, I think one of the main takeaways I actually had at Tesla was as a product manager, I used to be pretty focused on function, like what kind of utility is this product providing for the user? So similar, but coming to Tesla, I realized that's very much not what Tesla's about. Like people don't buy Teslas because it's an electric vehicle. They buy Teslas because it's sexy, and the fact that it's electric is just an add-on.
Hmm.
And similar to that's how we think about the in-car experience at Tesla. It's not about functionality, like being able to take work calls or being able to, you know, functional things that enable you to like offer Spotify or offer Pandora. It's more about sort of the feeling that you get when you sit in the car. Like, how can we make the Tesla as entertaining as your living room? And the fact that it's driving is just an add on.
Hmm. One of the assertions that you make in the essay is that self driving cars are going to have a really big impact on food delivery. And the way that you make that is you talk about the differences between what's happening in America and what's happening in China. And you pose a couple very interesting, one interesting statistic and another interesting anecdote. You talk about how in the United States, food delivery averages roughly $5, whereas in China, it's about one. And so you see this big delta between the costs of food delivery. And in terms of how that actually plays out, you mentioned that on Meituan, which is the China equivalent of Uber Eats, rather than only having restaurants, like professional restaurants on Uber Eats, what you see is people on Chinese platforms actually cooking out of their own homes. That surprised me. And how do you think that observation factors into your framework of what the future is going to look like?
Yeah, that's a really good point. So, one thing I think about often is how um, costs have a lot of downstream effects that we're not expecting. And it might not seem obvious at first, but you can kind of think of it as you can look at the impact that AWS had on a lot of web businesses. So before AWS, a lot of businesses had to invest hundreds of thousands of dollars in capital to create these server farms. Um, or they could rent out server space, which was also an issue with scaling up and down. And this created a big bottleneck on a lot of businesses. Like a lot of businesses were not able to get off the ground because they didn't have hundreds of thousands of dollars to invest. But once AWS um, came, was made public, it enabled a lot of businesses to freely spin up and spin down because they didn't have to worry about these high capital costs. And similarly, it allowed businesses to just experiment more freely because the cost of failing was much lower. And similarly, we'll see this with a lot of physical goods. I think starting with the food delivery space is super interesting because what self-driving cars are even going to do, and there's a whole point to be made about it's not even just self-driving, it's like even just electric cars is going to significantly decrease the cost of shipping as fuel costs are about 20% of trucking costs, for example. Um, but yeah, the combination of EV, AV is going to dramatically drive down shipping costs, which might seem very inconsequential at first, but when you think about all of the downstream impacts, it opens up opportunities for a lot of people because now, let's say, instead of a restaurant needing a certain amount of demand in order to offer food delivery, um, you could just be a home cook. And when food delivery costs, let's say, 50 cents instead of $10, it's much more economical for anyone to enter the market, to start cooking food in their home and start delivering it to customers.
In the essay, you talk about the impact, how the impact has to come to variable costs rather than fixed costs. What do you mean by that?
Oh, yeah, good question. So I think there's certain principles that you can discern with like whether a cost reduction is meaningful or not. So let's say I'm a factory and I'm able to negotiate a big discount for a piece of manufacturing equipment. Like instead of paying $1 million, I pay $100,000. That's really meaningful for me as a factory, but it doesn't have an industry-wide impact because it's only me who was able to get the discount. Whereas if there's something in my variable cost, like let's say like lithium typically costs $10 per gram and suddenly it costs $1 per gram, that's going to have massive downstream implications. Not am I only able to run my business more efficiently, but it also means I can use that money to invest in other things on a micro scale. And then on a macro scale, that also means that other players who previously couldn't afford this before can now enter the marketplace. Um, so in this example, it's either people who maybe didn't have capital costs to spend, like $5,000, $10,000 a month on rent in a downtown area. Now they don't need that because that's no longer a barrier to entry, but they can just get on the platform and start serving goods.
Yeah, one of the things that stuck out that seems to be a theme across a lot of these different platforms was, on one hand, you have the ease of creating a new entity, whether it's on cloud kitchens, being able to actually cook food in your home, or on Spotify, you mentioned certain artists who people don't even know who these artists are. It almost seems like they're either Spotify contracted them, or you have sort of the famous SoundCloud rapper who
Mhm.
was just making music in their room in high school and then all of a sudden became really big. And so, where on one hand you have this ability for anyone to enter the market, on the flip side, what you have is these platforms owning a lot of the demand and over time actually becoming having more bargaining power in the relationship. There's this great quote that you have from a Japanese restaurant in Harlem where the owner says, "Sometimes it seems like we're making food to make Seamless profitable. At the same time, Seamless is becoming a bulk part of our business, so it's not something that we can cut." And it seems to be this tension between it's getting easier and easier so anyone can build a business online, but then these platforms begin to control them, and soon these businesses almost become marginalized in the relationship. And how should we be thinking about this?
Yeah, that's a good question because on one hand, there's this tension between cost, making things cheaper, which allows the democratization of opportunity. Anyone can enter the marketplace. But then on the other hand, you also have some of these platforms who are using it to their advantage. Like you gave the example of Seamless taking advantage of restaurants. There's also an example where um, Uber's gathering a lot of data about what different what different consumers in different regions like to eat. They were able to predict the poke bowl trend and
Yep.
tell a restaurant in Canada, hey, you should spin up a poke bowl operation because we've seen it to be really successful in San Francisco and New York. Um, and so there is a question. I mean, it depends on where you want to approach it, like from the perspective of how I think there are several companies who have been able to approach this very successfully. And we kind of see a pushback from merchants actually. So you see this kind of on Seamless. Um, and I think what this does is it opens up opportunities for perhaps new business models. Like I think a lot of people look at Amazon and they say Amazon is going to dominate all of online retail. But at the same time, you also see a lot of merchants pulling off of Amazon because they'll start selling their razor blades on Amazon, and all of a sudden they notice Amazon is advertising Amazon Basics razor blades on the same page, and they want to start out their own shop. So I think we'll see opportunity for platforms that really prioritize merchants and have merchants' best interests at heart. And you see this a lot with Shopify. Like there's been a lot of there's this internal debate. Like if you listen to um, interviews with the CEO of why doesn't Shopify just become sort of an aggregator where they list all of their merchants' items in one place? And the question there is, well, for Shopify, one thing that they really value is, even though it seems like sort of an obvious decision, like would increase consumer discovery, might make it easier for merchants to have another distribution pipeline to get customers. But the way that Shopify sees it is it in the best interest of the merchants? And if we were to build sort of like an Etsy-like platform where we aggregate all merchants, it might not be in their best interest because there would be a lot of competition, maybe people trying to undercut each other. And so I think a new market opportunity is at play where we'll see a rise of platforms that are more merchant centered.
So until now, there's been a trade off between platforms that generate demand for you, but then you pay high fees, and platforms where then you can pay low fees, but you have to generate the demand. Do you see a future where a company could come and allow a merchant to pay low fees, but then help to generate demand?
Yeah, good question. So I think a simplistic or a simple way, a framework that I like to use to think about the online retail space is basically what you mentioned. So if I use Amazon, I have high high fees. I have to pay Amazon a huge percentage of my sales, but at the same time, I get the benefit taking of them taking care of distribution for me. Like I don't have to worry about demand or advertise my product. Amazon does all of that for me. Whereas with Shopify, they take much lower fees, but I have to rely on all of my own marketing channels. I have to learn how to use Facebook ads and Google ads and be responsible for trying to increase my conversion and look at that. And it's a pretty intensive process. And I think typically in the past, this has been a trade off. Like, do I want to pay high fees or do I want to have to go out and generate my own demand? And I have to choose between the two. But I think what Shopify has been doing is really exciting. So they launched something recently called Shopify Kit, which
Mm-hmm.
is basically a um, platform for all of the merchants to, if they have any questions about like, how can I add another marketing channel? Or like, I want to run Facebook ads. It's basically a personal assistant for all of your needs from a marketing and distribution perspective. And I think what they're doing there is really exciting because they're basically playing at one of their weaknesses, like why you would choose Amazon over Shopify, and trying to automate that process such that if I'm a merchant and I'm struggling with creating my own demand, I can just use Shopify Kit and have this personal assistant guide me through the process of running Facebook ads, increasing the conversion on my webpage, and so forth.
Do you know of any restaurants who do a really good job of generating demand? Like, if you were to look at the food
Mm,
delivery space, do you have a sense of the percentages but of restaurants that get phone delivery, and if there's certain restaurants that are really high because then they actually keep the margin? I mean, I walked into my sandwich shop that I go to all the time, and I started talking to the owner about, hey, it's kind of annoying because I call when I go at 1 p.m. and the phone line's always busy, But then I go and I order on Grubhub or Uber Eats, but then you lose the margin. What should I do? And they said, yeah, well, when you order on Uber Eats, we make 15 to 20% less. So if you can call, that'd be great. And
Mm,
they said, hey, why don't you call at 11 a.m. and then by the time it's 1, you will have it ready for you, but that's kind of difficult. And the nice thing about digital orders is just the throughput is higher because you can have multiple orders going on at a time, whereas on the phone, you can only be on one call at a time. And still, though, the fact that I call them so often and I have their number in my phone, I think implies that they own the demand. Do you know any restaurants that have a
mm.
big delivery revenue stream but aren't on any of these platforms?
Yeah, that's a good point. So I think we kind of see some restaurants trying to head in that direction where they don't have to give up fees to Seamless. Um, we like, I'm just thinking about the handful of apps I know, like Chipotle or Sweet Greens. They have their own
Mm-hmm.
proprietary app, and I think that's been made like increasingly possible with the rise of like low code apps, making it really easy to just build your own iPhone app. Um, but I think that brings in another interesting point about where the value will be. So I think like there's kind of two sectors here. One part of the value is being a platform, aggregating all the supplies and making demand, so serving up the demand for all of your suppliers, whether that's like Sweetgreens, Chipotle, or like some small businesses, some small restaurants who need demand. And on the other side, um, we see the rise of platforms like Shopify or like low code apps like Bubble that make it really easy to just build your own iPhone app. Um, and then like this third category of people trying to make shipping infrastructure really easy. So like if I design my own app, like I still need to figure out some way to get these goods from point A to point B. And that's another space that I think is really exciting that hasn't been explored. So we see Shopify kind of moving into this space where we traditionally think of them as just an e-commerce front end, but they're actually building out like a whole back end of fulfillment services and warehouses. Um, and then also with Neuro, where a lot of AV companies are focused on driverless cars and transporting humans. But I think that's going to be long ways away. And really, where the immediate opportunity is in transporting goods and starting with transporting goods. And we actually don't see Waymo or Tesla or Cruise or any of these big AV companies really focusing on this. But there is a smaller startup called Neuro, which is focusing directly on like driverless transportation of goods. And they recently just signed a deal with Walmart to do autonomous grocery delivery.
Wow. So why don't you talk about let's focus on this logistics aspect for a little while. What do you see happening with the last mile problem? So I think that there's an urban last mile problem which will be solved very differently from a suburban or rural last mile problem. And what I mean by that is like when the Amazon delivery guy comes on my street, what he does is he parks in the middle of the street, he gets out, and then he goes to deliver to 5, 10 houses within walking distance. And it's the same thing with the USPS guy. He walks around the neighborhood and delivers something to every single house. And you can only do that with urban delivery because of the density. But what happens
Mm-hmm.
with suburban delivery? You know, there's places like the USPS, companies like the USPS, which they have to deliver to places in rural Alaska, in the northern tip of Maine, in the cold of winter. And what do you see happening here? Do you see anything happening with drones or anything like that? Or where is the last mile problem constrained?
Yeah, that's a good question because last mile delivery is actually one of the toughest parts and most expensive parts of delivery. Like it's really easy to, I know, and a metaphor might be to transport um, like 100 passengers from San Francisco to New York, but really difficult to transport once all of those passengers are in New York, like 100 individual passengers to wherever they're going. And so I think
Hmm.
um, that's where like things like drones and AV cars come in, where it makes last mile delivery really efficient and really cheap. Mm.
Yeah, with the suburban stuff, what you do have the benefit of is no buildings and stuff like that. Do you know where drones are in terms of how the technology is coming and what their carrying capacity is? So maybe they can carry 30 pounds, but they can't carry 50 pounds. And is it efficient from an energy perspective to deliver to rural areas?
That's a good question. So a lot of people see drones as pretty far away, but I think there's some pretty exciting companies in the space. So like one is Zipline, which is using like really lightweight material like styrofoam, and they're focusing on delivering medical supplies in Ghana. And I think drone delivery is actually much quicker than we think. I think the main bottleneck there is has been regulation. Um, so regulation of the airspace. Mhm. I know there are some interesting facts. Like I was talking to somebody who works at Uber the other day, and I learned that most of Uber Eats sales actually come from orders that are over $100. So
Wow.
you would think that most sales come from, $10, $15, but actually they've been doing pretty well in suburban areas. Mhm. Yeah, but that's a good question that I'd want to explore more about drone delivery and how close that is.
Within the autonomous trucking industry, you mentioned the operational costs of trucking in the essay, and you say that driver wages are about a third of the cost of any kind of trucking. Fuel's another 21%. Truck lease, purchase payment, 16%. And then going down to order, you have repair and maintenance, driver benefits, and then insurance premiums and tolls are a bit lower. And so what I see here is that benefits and wages are almost half of what
Hmm.
it costs to ship something. And so you were mentioning earlier that electric is going to be the first big transition, but it seems like in order to get that order of magnitude shift that is actually transformative, you need to see self-driving. Is that right?
Um, yeah, that's true. I actually think the reduction from just electric vehicles by itself is pretty significant. So breaking it down, like even if self-driving takes a while, fuel costs plus maintenance. So electric vehicles are also much easier to maintain. A lot of people think about fuel, but they don't think about repair and maintenance. Like your average powertrain in an internal combustion engine has hundreds of parts compared to your electric powertrain, which has much fewer, like 10 or less.
Hmm.
And so that leads to less repair and maintenance costs. So put together with fuel, which is 30%, that's about like a 40% reduction just to electrify your fleet. And that's why Amazon recently invested like hundreds of thousands of dollars into buying Rivian's electric trucking fleet. And so I think it's just a matter of time before we see like 40% reduction in trucking costs alone. And then on top of that, like driver wages plus insurance is around 40%. So that's another 40% once we get to driverless. So that's around like 80% reduction in trucking costs with electric and driverless, which I think, yeah, is really exciting because then that's when we'll start to see a lot of the downstream impacts in shipping being cheaper and then an increase in supply and a democratization of supply, leading to the structure of different industries changing, starting with food delivery. Um, yeah, actually, the comparables for trucking is interesting when you compare it with drones. So with drones, it's a bit more difficult to break down, but the projections that we've seen for drones is at an average of 90% decrease. So if it costs $10 to ship a package in a 5 mile radius with UPS, a drone would cost $1 to ship a package.
Wow.
And so, yeah, you can imagine how this lowers barriers to entry in terms of people who want to ship goods. So both like new players, we'll see a lot of new players being able to produce goods, but I think for also current players, we'll see their costs massively decrease, which will enable a lot of businesses that weren't viable before to be more viable. So, for example, let's say Stitch Fix isn't that widely adopted yet. They're probably strangled by high shipping and high return costs. But imagine Stitch Fix was able to do 100 times the volume they are now because their costs are much cheaper. That would lead to many downstream impacts. Like it's not just about now we're able to operate more efficiently, but it's now we're able to serve more customers. We're able to have more data. You kind of get a Netflix-like effect where the more data you accumulate, the better recommendations you're able to make, which was previously only true for digital goods.
So let's talk about, as we begin to close here, your vision for the future. And one of the things that you talk a lot about is subscriptions. You talk about Spotify and you talk about Stitch Fix, and through subscriptions you get to a death of advertising. Why is advertising going to go into a decline now that we have these relationships with big platforms, more data, and lower costs of transportation and logistics?
Right. So what's interesting when you think about what might lead to the decline of advertising, one of the big things is subscription bundles. And subscription bundles are a great business model for businesses. Like almost every business wants to start a subscription bundle because for them it means we don't have to go out and spend thousands of dollars acquiring customers every month. We just have recurring revenue that comes in. But unfortunately, not all businesses, subscription models don't always make sense. So subscription models typically make sense when you have really low cost of distribution. This is why it makes sense for Netflix because if it only costs me, let's say, 5 cents streaming costs to stream thousands of movies to consumers, it makes much more sense for me to just package them as a deal and sell it for $10 a month. This would make less sense if I were a Blockbuster and I wanted to offer like an unlimited video rental service where it might cost, I would have much higher distribution costs. And how that relates to advertising is what we're seeing slowly is instead of consumers being the choosers of the bundle, like I want to watch this movie because I saw an ad on it, or I want to listen to Drake because I listened to an ad on him. It becomes the bundle. It becomes Netflix and Spotify choosing the recommendation. So what I've noticed is that increasingly, instead of relying on friend recommendations or advertisements to decide what I listen to, like most likely how I found out about a really cool song was just playing a song on Spotify, and then the Spotify algorithm recommends the next song to me, and I'm like, oh, this is really good. Let me add it to my liked songs list. And similarly, I think we'll see this as we move into the realm of physical goods. As distribution for physical goods becomes cheaper, it's going to make more sense to bundle them. And we'll see companies like Stitch Fix being the choosers of the bundle rather than consumers themselves.
Interesting. There seems to be a psychological effect here, and it could very well be a placebo, but we've seen that the placebo effect often works. And so I think it's worth taking seriously. But I find that a lot of things that I find through algorithmic recommendations. But a lot of things that I love, they seem to still come from friends. Generally, I'm out at a friend's house, maybe out at a bar, and I'll listen to a song, and a friend will say, oh, I love this song. And those then end up not being the kinds of songs often that would have been served up to me, but due to the memory that is created in that moment, then I can start liking that song, and it reminds me of a friend. And likewise, my favorite purchase of last year was these Lululemon stretchy pants. And they're sort of like these jean pants, and they sort of stretch out. They're like, but then you could work out in them. They're amazing. They're like the best pants ever. And my friend Kevin recommended them to me. So every time I wear them, I also think of Kevin. And the thing is, I would have never really bought them otherwise. They're just too expensive, and I was just like, I don't want to do this. And I ended up buying them for myself for my birthday. But I think that there's something here that the fact that I would have never listened to those songs from the recommendation, if I was just sort of working and just saw that, I would have been like, yeah, not really my style. And same with the pants, if I'd found that in an advertisement. And I think that for me, because I do buy so little, like I would never subscribe to one of these sort of subscription clothing platforms or anything like that. Don't think I've bought any new clothes in almost a year. And so for me, it's like friend recommendations hold so much weight, and I could, you could say in aggregate, that's probably not true. That's like saying someone really likes going to the movies, but then in aggregate, you have a bunch of people going to watch movies on Netflix. Maybe that's the case, but I don't know. There might be something psychological here that you're underestimating.
Yeah, I definitely think there's a very emotional connection with the things that we buy, and people tend to make decisions either emotionally or logically for buying something. But I think vastly people tend to make decisions emotionally and then they reverse justify it with logic. Um, so I think that's a good point, and there's definitely still a space for like friend recommendations. But I think on the other hand, there's still an element of um, the wire cutter, for example, has become very popular. And even though recommendations are really popular for maybe something that might have an emotional connection like music, we still see the wire cutter, Sweet Home being really useful when people want, they're avid fans of the wire cutter. I want to find the best vacuum cleaner. And having a trusted source is something that's still to be valued. And I think maybe that's just about the way that it's packaged. Um, like rather than as a utility like Amazon, is it a brand that I can identify with and a brand source that I trust? And I think that's something that we're kind of starting to see. I mean, we see this with certain brands already, like Lululemon or like Everlane. I could presume that there could be like a platform that does this as well, like forming that emotional connection with a brand like Stitch Fix. Like right now, Stitch Fix is just a supplier of goods, but they've actually started creating their own in-house um, apparel design service called Hybrid Designs, where they use hybrid designs to fill the gaps in their inventory. So they'll notice that, oh, like 40-year-old women tend to like blouses with this kind of sleeve, but none of our suppliers carry this kind of sleeve. So let's build that in-house so we can deliver this kind of product to our customers.
Interesting. Well, Adrienne, congratulations on your essay, and thank you very much.
Thanks, David.